I was driving home from the attorney's office in a good mood, ready to tell my son that his aunt had left me a lake house and $1.8 million in investments. But when I stepped onto my porch, I heard his wife's voice through the window. What she said next made me stop cold in my tracks. I have driven Route 9 out of Montpelier more times than I could count. It is not a remarkable road. 2 lanes through small Vermont towns, gas stations and feed stores, and the occasional diner with hand-painted signs in the window. In November, the trees are bare and the light comes down flat and gray through the branches, and the hills look like they have been stripped down to their honest bones. I have always liked that about Vermont in winter. The lack of pretense, everything exactly as it is. I made that drive on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of November, and I was in better spirits than I had any right to be, considering 3 hours at Patricia Aldridge's office in Burlington, 3 hours of documents and disclosures and signatures on pages I had read twice before signing, because that is the only way I know how to do anything. My hand had moved through each one slowly, not from hesitation, from the particular weight of understanding what I was signing. Margaret had left me everything. The lake house on the Champlain shore, appraised at $2.3 million. The investment portfolio, managed through a fiduciary she had used for years, standing at $1.8. A collection of smaller accounts that Patricia had not yet fully cataloged. The total estate somewhere north of $4 million. All of it designated for me in a will she had updated 18 months before she died, when her physician had told her privately that her heart was failing, and she had made the decision, the very Margaret decision, not to tell anyone. I sat in my car in the parking structure across from Patricia's building for about 10 minutes after the meeting, before I started driving. Not from shock exactly. Shock implies being unprepared, and after 32 years on the federal bench you are, if nothing else, prepared for outcomes you did not anticipate. More from the stillness that settles over you when something has happened that you cannot undo or fix. Margaret was gone. The $4 million was mine, and the only person I wanted to tell was the one person I had not spoken to in 11 years. I merged onto Route 9 and let the miles pass. Margaret Louise Calloway was 4 years younger than me and had always been, in the taxonomy of our family, the quiet one. I was the one who argued at the dinner table, who pushed back against our father's certainties, who left Vermont at 22 for law school in Boston, and came back only for holidays until I had built enough of a life that the visits felt like choices rather than obligations. Margaret stayed. She went to the University of Vermont, got a degree in English literature, came back to Burlington, and started teaching at Burlington High School in 1979. She taught there for 30 years. Advanced placement English mostly, Shakespeare and Steinbeck, and the occasional contemporary novel that the curriculum committee debated, and she taught anyway. We were close for most of our adult lives in the way that siblings are close when geography keeps them apart more than they would like, but family occasions pull them back together reliably. Thanksgiving in Montpelier, Christmas alternating between Burlington and wherever I was, phone calls on birthdays, the occasional letter, because Margaret still wrote letters on paper. She had a handwriting that looked like a schoolteacher's, which it was, of course, precise and slightly formal, with loops on the lowercase letters that looked like they had been practiced until they came out right. I cannot point to the moment we stopped being what we had been to each other. That is the honest answer. I can point to our mother's funeral, January 8 years ago, and the kind of Vermont cold that gets into the funeral home despite the heating and sits in your chest the whole afternoon. Our mother died at 83, peacefully, in the way that our parents' generation seemed more able to do than ours does. She had been declining for 2 years, and she had been ready, and we had been as prepared as you can be, which is never quite as prepared as you think. What was said at the reception afterward, in the kitchen of my mother's house, which we were already thinking about what to do with, I will not repeat here in full. It was not one enormous thing. It was several small things said in grief and exhaustion that added up to an accusation I was not prepared to absorb and a defense I should not have made. Margaret said I had been absent. I said she had made choices that amounted to staying small. Those words were mine, and I have turned them over many times in the years since, as if a woman who chose to teach teenagers how to read and write and think had made some lesser decision than the man who chose a federal judgeship. I knew it was wrong, even as I said it. We did not speak after the funeral. I sent a card at Easter the first year. She did not respond. I told myself she needed time. Another year passed. I told myself I would call when I found the right moment. The right moment has a way of not arriving when you are waiting for it. By the time I understood that the silence had become permanent, I had already let 5 years go by, and 5 years of silence has a weight to it that makes the first phone call feel impossible. I knew how to begin exactly one conversation with my sister, and it began with the words, "I am sorry for what I said," and I could not make myself dial the number. Her attorney reached me in November, 3 weeks before the Wednesday I am describing. Patricia Aldridge called my workshop phone on a Tuesday morning while I was sanding a rocking chair that had been sitting in raw pine for 2 years. I almost did not answer. I was on a good stretch with the chair, the grain coming out the way I wanted it, the kind of quiet work that settles something in you. I picked up on the 4th ring. "Mr. Calloway, this is Patricia Aldridge from Aldridge & Stern. I am calling regarding the estate of Margaret Calloway." I set down the sandpaper. The workshop was cold the way Vermont workshops are cold in November, a cold that comes up through the floor and settles settles in your knees if you stand still too long. Are you the brother of Margaret Louise Calloway, formerly of Burlington? I sat on the nearest stool. Yes, I'm sorry to tell you this way. Your sister passed away 6 weeks ago. Cardiac arrest, at home. She was 71. She had named you as her sole beneficiary. I've been trying to reach you. The number we had on file was an old one. The workshop smelled like sawdust and cold concrete and the faint oil smell of the space heater in the corner that I had been meaning to replace for 3 years. I could hear my own breathing. I didn't know she was sick. She wasn't in any outward way. Her physician said her heart had been failing quietly for some time. She had known, Mr. Calloway. She chose not to tell anyone. That sounded exactly like Margaret. She would rather disappear quietly than ask anyone to grieve on her behalf. She would rather write a letter and not send it than make a phone call that required you to respond in real time. Patricia read me the note from the will. It was 11 lines in Margaret's handwriting. The school teacher loops, the practiced precision. And it said what I had spent 11 years hoping she had thought, which was that she had watched my career from a distance and had been proud of me without ever saying so, and that the money was her way of saying so now, and that she asked me to use it well. I had to put the phone down for a moment. Just set it on the workbench next to the rocking chair, and stand in the cold workshop air and let what had happened be real. My sister had known she was dying and had updated her will and had not called me. She had written me 11 lines on paper and attached them to a legal document so that I would receive them only after she was gone, when there was nothing either of us could do about any of the time we had wasted. That is not a criticism. I understood exactly why she had done it that way. We were the same kind of people. We both found it easier to say the true thing when the other person could not respond immediately and require us to navigate their response. She had taught Shakespeare for 30 years. She knew what letters could do that conversations could not. I picked the phone back up and told Patricia I would be in her office the following Wednesday. I did not tell anyone, not my son, not his wife, not Raymond or any of the few old colleagues I still spoke to regularly. I drove to Burlington alone 3 weeks later on a gray November Wednesday and signed my name to documents that made me the owner of more money than I had earned in 32 years of public service. And then I sat in my car in the parking structure for 10 minutes thinking about a woman who had corrected teenagers' grammar for 3 decades and left me $4 million and 11 lines of handwriting. I want to tell you about my son before I tell you what happened next, because without knowing who he was, it will not make complete sense why it hit me the way it did. His name is Walter, same as mine. We called him Walt to avoid the confusion. He was 38 that November, lean like me, quiet in the same ways, with a particular quality of stillness that had always reminded me of Margaret more than of me, though I had never told him that. His mother, my ex-wife Carol, had been gone from our lives since Walt was 12. Gone from our house, I mean, not from his life, because Carol was a good mother. She simply stopped being a wife and made the decision clearly and without cruelty, which I had respected at the time and still did. Walt split his time between us through high school and went to a small college in New Hampshire on a partial academic scholarship and came back to Vermont because he was, in this as in other things, like me. He could not imagine the landscape of his life anywhere else. He had started the landscaping business 8 years ago with a business partner who turned out to have a talent for invoicing clients and a very poor talent for paying suppliers, and by the time Walt understood the full shape of what the business had become, the debt had already structured itself in a way that was difficult to untangle. He came to me 3 months before that November with his wife Dinah and told me about it plainly, which I respected, and asked if they could stay with me while they figured out next steps, which I said yes to immediately, because that is what fathers do, and because my house has 4 bedrooms and has felt too large for one person since Carol left and Walt went to college, and because I was genuinely glad of the company. Dana was Walt's second serious relationship, and they had been married for 4 years. She was smart and organized and had the kind of administrative precision that Walt, who was better at the physical work of running a business than the financial management of it, genuinely needed. She kept the household running with an efficiency that I appreciated from a practical standpoint. She had a way of being attentive that I had always taken, in the 3 years I had known her, as warmth. I was revising that understanding on the drive home from Burlington. I want to be precise about what I was feeling on that drive, because I have thought about it many times since, and I think the feeling was more complicated than what I allowed myself to experience at the time. I was happy. That is the simplest version. I had $4 million, and I was driving home to tell my son about it, and I was already running through what I wanted to say. I was going to tell him about Margaret first, about the 11 years and the silence and the note she had written to the will. I wanted him to understand that the money had a story attached to it, and that the story was more important than the number. Then I was going to tell him the number, and watch what happened to his face, and think about what we might do together with the practical reality of it. I was thinking about the lake house specifically. A $2.3 million property on Lake Champlain had more rooms than one person needed. I was thinking about whether Walt and Dana might want to live there, or whether we might arrange something, use it as a family property. I was thinking about the scholarship for Margaret's school. I was thinking, for the first time in years, that the future had a shape I could see and plan toward. I did not go inside right away. I parked the car in the driveway and sat with the engine off for a moment, the way I sometimes do, in the particular quiet of a car that has just stopped moving. It was 4:45 in the afternoon, afternoon, and already getting dark, the way Vermont afternoons do in November, the light dropping fast behind the hills. The house was lit from inside. I could see through the dining room window on the left side of the house where the curtains were open. Walt and Dana were at the table, leaning toward each other. Even from the driveway, 20 feet away, I could read something in their posture, the particular angle of an urgent conversation, the compression of two people who have something to resolve. 32 years on the federal bench teaches you to read rooms, not just in courtrooms, in every room. You develop a sensitivity to the quality of the air in a space before you enter it, a reading of posture and proximity, and the velocity of speech that happens faster than conscious thought. I sat in the car and registered what I was seeing and felt the first faint shadow of something that was not quite suspicion, but was the precondition for it. I got out of the car. I walked up the path. The porch boards always creak at the second step, so I stepped over it out of the habit I had developed years ago. For the mornings, Walt was home from college and sleeping in late. Old habits like that stay in the muscle memory long after the reason for them has passed. The dining room window was cracked open about an inch. Dana always wanted it that way, said the house ran too warm, a complaint I had always accepted without fully understanding since the house had perfectly adequate temperature regulation. I was at the porch railing, reaching for the front door, when I heard her voice. He doesn't know we found out. Move fast before he does anything. I stopped. The cold air off the yard, the ticking of the car engine cooling behind me, the particular quality of silence that falls on a November evening in Vermont when the birds have already left and the wind drops. I did not move. The moment he transfers anything, we contest it. Say he's not mentally fit. My cousin's a doctor. One evaluation, and we control everything. I stood at that porch railing for what I later estimated was 4 minutes. I know it was approximately 4 minutes because I noted the time on my watch when I finally moved. And when I look back at the sequence of thoughts I moved through, 4 minutes is about right for that many thoughts at that pace. The first thought was simple. They knew. Someone had told them, or they had found a way to learn it themselves. Patricia Aldridge's office kept standard confidentiality protocols, but wills passed through probate, documents are filed, and anyone motivated enough and knowledgeable enough about the system could find their way to the information. I filed that question away for later, how they had found out, and moved on. The second thought was about the specific plan I had just heard described. Not mentally fit. My cousin's a doctor. One evaluation. These were not the words of someone who had just conceived of something in the abstract. This was vocabulary that came from research. Someone had looked into the mechanics of elder guardianship proceedings. Someone had identified the leverage point, a medical evaluation, and had already identified the specific professional who would provide it. This was not improvisation. This was a plan that had been developed over some period of time, which meant it had been developed while they were living in my house and eating at my table and asking me how my day had gone. The third thought, and the one that cost me the most to think, was about my son. Walt had been at that table. He had been in that conversation. He had not been the one speaking in the 30 seconds I had heard, but his presence in the room was its own kind of participation. In 32 years on the bench, I had learned to distinguish between the person who designs a scheme and the person who goes along with one. And I had learned that the second category was morally distinct from the first, but was not innocent. Going along is a choice. Silence in the presence of wrongdoing is a form of consent. I noted that thought. I set it aside. I had 32 years of practice setting aside the thoughts that would compromise my ability to function. I took a breath in through the nose and out through the mouth, an old technique from the early years on the bench, when I was still learning how to sit in the chair of a difficult decision and not let my face tell the room what I was carrying. Then I opened the front door and walked inside. The dining room went quiet when I came in, not conspicuously. They were not mid-sentence, the way it would have been if they had heard me on the porch. Walt looked up from the table and said, "Hey, how was the drive?" Dana stood up from her chair and went to the kitchen with the smooth purposefulness of someone who had been waiting for a reason to move. I set my coat on the hook by the door and said the drive was fine. Good, actually. Clear roads. I said I was hungry. I asked what we had. Dana said she had made pasta. Was that all right? I said that was more than all right. I sat down at the table with my son, and we talked about the drive and the weather and a sports story he had seen that afternoon, and I watched his face while we talked, and I gave him nothing. Nothing in my eyes that told him what I had heard. Nothing in the set of my shoulders that was different from any other evening. Walt had known me his whole life, and he knew my face better than almost anyone, and I still gave him nothing, because 32 years of sitting behind a bench in a room where you are not permitted to have a reaction teaches you, if you survive it, to actually not have the reaction. Not to suppress it, to genuinely not have it, for as long as you need to not have it. Dana set pasta on the table and poured wine, and asked how the appointment had gone. I said the estate was more complicated than I had expected, that there were tax matters and property assessments that needed to be resolved before the full picture was clear, that it might take several months, that I wasn't sure yet what any of it amounted to. I watched her face while I said this. She was good. The adjustment she made from whatever she had been expecting to what I had actually said was small and fast, a recalibration that happened in the space of a breath, a slight loosening around the eyes that meant she was absorbing new information and reorienting. It lasted less than a second. She said that sounded stressful and poured more wine and said to let her know if there was anything she could do to help with the paperwork. I said I would. We ate dinner. We talked about things that had nothing to do with money or wills or the conversation conversation I had overheard 40 minutes earlier. I refilled my glass once. I helped clear the table. I said I was tired and was going to sit in my chair for a while before bed, which was my routine and would cause no comment. I went to my armchair in the sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, and I opened the book that was on the side table, and I sat there and I thought for about an hour, during which Dana and Walt moved around the house in the way that a couple moves around a house when they believe the other adult in it is tired and settled and not paying particular attention. They spoke in the kitchen. I could hear the register of their voices, not always the words, but the rhythm of the conversation, and I noted its particular quality of urgency underneath the domestic surface sounds. I was not performing calm. I had actually achieved a version of it, the kind that comes not from feeling nothing but from feeling everything fully, and then making the deliberate decision that action would wait. After they went upstairs, I sat for another 20 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia Aldridge. She did not answer, which was not surprising at 8 in the evening, so I left a message telling her that I had a concern about the confidentiality of the estate proceedings and asking her to call me first thing in the morning. Then I called Raymond Castillo. Raymond and I had served together on the First Circuit for 11 years. He was 70 now, still sharp, living in a farmhouse 20 minutes outside Montpellier because he claimed the cold kept him honest, which was a thing he said and more or less believed. We had spoken 8 months ago, briefly, about nothing consequential. He picked up on the second ring. Raymond, I said, I need to talk to someone who has worked elder guardianship abuse cases. He paused. Then, how bad? Bad enough that I am calling you at 8 on a Wednesday. He told me to tell him. I told him everything. The drive, the attorney's office, the estate, what I had overheard on the porch, and what it meant in specific legal terms. The phrase, not mentally fit, which is the threshold language for guardianship petitions under Vermont law. The reference to a cousin who was a doctor. The specific word evaluation, which told me they understood the procedural requirements. Raymond listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that serious people are quiet when they are actually thinking rather than just waiting to respond. What you're describing is a felony, he said. Elder guardianship fraud. Potentially conspiracy depending on how far the planning has gone. If the physician, this cousin, is involved in fabricating a competency evaluation, that is a separate matter with separate consequences. License revocation, criminal exposure. I know. Walter, are you all right? I wrapped my hand around the arm of the chair. The sitting room was quiet, the house settling around me the way old houses do in cold weather. Small sounds in the walls. I will be, I said. Raymond was quiet again for a moment, and then he said, you know what you need to do? I do. You need documentation, recorded conversations if you can get them legally. Vermont is single-party consent. You can record any conversation you are a participant in. You need to let the scheme develop far enough to constitute overt acts. Discussion alone is not enough, and you need to contact the Financial Crimes Unit. I have a connection there through a former clerk who is now at the Attorney General's office. Do you want me to make that call? No, I want to make it myself. I want to be precise about what I tell them. Raymond said he understood. He gave me the name of the detective at the Financial Crimes Unit. Okafor, he said. Reliable, careful, knows elder fraud well. He gave me his former clerk's name for a reference. Then he said, how long do you think they have been planning this? I turned that question over for a moment. The vocabulary was specific enough, and the reference to the cousin physician specific enough that this had not been something assembled in a night. A week, minimum, more likely 2 or 3, which meant it had been assembled while they were living in my house, which meant every dinner and every conversation, and every evening I had sat in this chair reading while they spoke in the kitchen had been occurring on top of this. I said, long enough. He said, then move carefully and move thoroughly. Don't let them see anything has changed. I told him I understood. We said goodnight. I sat in the chair for a while longer, in the dark, listening to the sounds of the old house, and I thought about everything I needed to do. I want to be honest about what I was feeling in that chair that night and in the days that followed, because I think the honest account matters more than the clean one. I was not only strategic, I was also hurt, not surprised. You spend enough years on the bench and you understand that human beings are capable of this, and worse, and you have seen the faces of the people who do these things, and you know they look like everyone else. But understanding something is possible is not the same as being prepared for it when the person doing it is someone you have known since birth, someone whose face still carries, in its resting state, the face of the 16-year-old who helped you build a stone wall one summer and asked you every 20 minutes whether it looked straight. I noted the hurt. I set it aside. I had a great deal of work to do. The next morning, I went to my workshop at 6:30, which was my usual time and would cause no comment. I found the small digital recorder I had used for 20 years of bench notes, a simple device, the size of a thumb drive, good battery life, reliable in cold weather. I tested it. I placed it in the breast pocket of the cardigan I wore around the house most evenings, checked that the fabric was not muffling the microphone, and confirmed that it was picking up speech at normal conversational distance. Then I sat at my workbench and made notes on a legal pad of everything I had heard the previous evening, time-stamped as best I could reconstruct it, and sealed the notes in an envelope addressed to Raymond. I called Detective Okafor at 8 that morning. He had been briefed by Raymond's contact at the Attorney General's office and was expecting my call. I described the situation in precise terms, the estate, the overheard conversation, the specific language used, the reference to the physician, and he listened with the quality of attention that a serious person gives to something they recognize as significant. significant. He asked me if I was willing to let the situation develop for a controlled period, to allow the planning to advance far enough to constitute overt criminal acts rather than mere discussion. I told him I was, on one condition, that when the time came, it happened completely, that there was no opportunity for anything to be walked back, minimized, or attributed to misunderstanding. He said that was exactly how they intended to run it. We agreed that I would call him again when I had the first recorded material. He told me what to look for as evidence of overt acts, the actual filing of a guardianship petition, the actual contact of a physician for fraudulent evaluation purposes, any actual movement of funds. He told me that the recorded conversations, combined with either a filed petition or confirmed physician contact, would give them more than enough. I thanked him, went back to the workshop, and worked on the rocking chair for an hour, because nothing about my routine could change, and because the chair needed work, and because there is something clarifying about physical work when your mind has a great deal to carry. What followed were 14 days that I will not pretend were easy, but that I can say I moved through with the methodical steadiness that the work required. Every evening I sat in my armchair with the recorder running in my pocket. Dana, it turned out, was not particularly careful about what she said in the house once she believed that I had accepted the fiction of her intentions and that I was operating as a man who did not know what was coming. She used the kitchen table for what I came to think of as working sessions when Walt came home in the evenings, and she laid out the current state of the plan. The first session, 2 nights after I overheard the porch conversation, concerned logistics. She had spoken to her cousin, a psychiatrist in Burlington whose name she said aloud and which I wrote down afterward, and confirmed that he was able to provide what she called an evaluation document indicating early cognitive decline. She used that phrase, evaluation document, not a diagnosis, not a clinical assessment, a document. The functional distinction she was making was between something that would be true and something that would be usable, and she was thinking entirely in terms of the second category. She told Walt that the evaluation would need to happen before I had a chance to do anything significant with the portfolio. Once any major transfer was made, the nature of what they were contesting changed. It was cleaner, she said, to move before rather than after. Walt asked what happened if I didn't go along with a medical appointment. She said they would frame it as a routine checkup, that I was getting older, that Walt had noticed some things that concerned him, that it was just responsible. She said, he trusts you. He will go if you ask him. There was a silence after she said that. I sat in my armchair and turned a page of my book. Walt said, what kind of things am I supposed to have noticed? She said, forgetfulness, getting confused about dates, maybe one incident where he got disoriented driving somewhere familiar. Another silence. He's not actually showing any of that, Walt said. She said, he doesn't have to be actually showing it. He just has to be documented as showing it. That's the distinction. I noted the exact wording in my head and transferred it to the legal pad after they went to bed. The second session, 3 evenings later, covered the financial mechanics. The account name she intended to transfer the portfolio into once guardianship was established. The sequence of steps: petition filed, temporary guardian appointed pending hearing, immediate petition to the probate court for authority over financial decisions. She had researched the Vermont probate process carefully. She knew the timelines. She knew which court would have jurisdiction. She knew the standard language used in temporary guardianship petitions to establish urgency. She also mentioned, in this session, that she had found documentation in my desk drawer. She said it in a way that was matter of fact, as if the finding were unremarkable, as if going through someone else's desk in their own house were a normal thing to have done. She had found a copy of the preliminary estate summary from Patricia Aldridge's office, a document I had left in my desk because I had not thought I needed to hide it, because the people living in my house were my family. She had the actual numbers, the $2.3 million on the lake property, the $1.8 in investments, the total figure. Walt was quiet for a long moment after she said the total. Then he said, that's a lot of money. She said, yes. He said, he was going to tell us that night. He came home from the attorneys and he was going to tell us. And then he said it was complicated. She said, I know. He said, why didn't he tell us? She said, because he heard us first. There was a long silence after that. I sat in my armchair in the adjacent room and I turned a page of my book and I did not move. Walt said quietly, does he know that we know? She said, I don't think so. I think he just decided to play it safe until the estate was sorted. He's cautious. That's how he is. Walt said, what if he tells someone, an attorney or someone? She said, then we move faster. But I don't think he will. He's private about this kind of thing. He'll manage it quietly and we'll have time. I noted the specific phrases. I transferred them to the legal pad after they went upstairs. On the 8th day, Walt told me over breakfast that he had made me a doctor's appointment. He said he had been noticing that I seemed tired lately, that I had seemed a little off, and that he had found a doctor in Burlington who came highly recommended. He said the name. I looked at my son's face when he said the name. He held my gaze and his expression was exactly right. Concerned, solicitous, the face of a son who has noticed something worrying in his father and wants to address it responsibly. It was a performed expression, not performed badly, actually quite well done. But I had been watching people perform expressions in courtrooms for 32 years, and performance has a quality that genuine concern does not, a slight extra precision, a millisecond of maintenance, and I saw it in his face for the length of a breath before he smoothed it over. I said that sounded fine, and asked if he would like eggs. I called Detective Okafor that afternoon from the workshop with the door closed. I told him about the physician. I gave him the name. He said he would run it. He called back 2 hours later and said the physician had a Vermont license in good standing and a private practice in Burlington and no disciplinary history. He said the medical board contact was ready to be made the moment there was evidence of actual fraudulent evaluation. He asked if I was willing to go to the appointment. I said yes. He said he would like me to have the recorder running. I said it would be. The appointment was on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after I had stood on the porch and heard Dana's voice through the cracked window. Walt drove. It was the kind of Vermont December morning that is clear and hard and very cold. The sky a bright blue that does not offer warmth. The bare trees casting long, thin shadows across the road. I sat in the passenger seat in my good overcoat with the recorder running in the breast pocket and watched the landscape and thought about Margaret's note, about what I would say to her if I could, about whether I had done enough in the time between the call from Patricia Aldridge and this morning to deserve something like the grace she had extended to me in that note. I thought about the scholarship. Margaret had been on the AP English faculty for most of her career, and I wanted it to go to students who stayed up until midnight writing essays that no one had asked them to write, who read beyond the curriculum because the curriculum did not satisfy them, who did the kind of quiet intellectual work that does not get noticed at award ceremonies. Margaret would have known exactly which students those were. Walt drove the route from Montpelier to Burlington, with his hands at 10 and 2 the way I had taught him when he was 16. He talked about nothing in particular with a careful cheerfulness that I recognized as someone managing anxiety by filling silence. I let him fill it. I said occasional things that confirmed I was listening. I watched the road. The physician's office was on the 3rd floor of a medical building on Church Street. Pleasant waiting room, neutral colors, a fish tank. The kind of waiting room designed to say nothing. Walt sat beside me and talked about the aquarium in the corner with the kind of conversation you make when you are managing a script. When they called my name, he stood to come with me. I said, I prefer to go in alone. He said, the doctor likes to have a family member present for the initial assessment. I looked at him for a moment. I said, I have been going to doctors alone for 63 years, and I do not intend to change that today. He sat back down. The receptionist looked at me with a neutrality that told me she had been told to expect resistance on this point. I went in alone. The physician had the practiced warmth of someone who performs it regularly. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and opened a folder and said he was glad I had come in, that Walt had been quite concerned and that it was good to address these things early. I said, what things specifically? He said, memory concerns, disorientation. Your son mentioned an incident last week where you had difficulty finding your way home from the grocery store. I said, I have lived in Montpelier for 21 years. I have never once had difficulty finding my way home from the grocery store. He made a note. He said, patients are often not aware of these episodes at the time. He proceeded with what he described as a standard cognitive assessment. Date and time. Count backwards from 100 by sevens. Remember 3 words. Apple, honesty, 17, and repeat them back in 10 minutes. I answered everything correctly. He made notes throughout that I could not read from my angle. Toward the end of the assessment, he said, I understand this might feel unnecessary, but the concerns your son raised are consistent with early-stage presentations that are worth documenting carefully. I said, I want to ask you something directly. He looked up. I said, how many of these assessments do you conduct per year? And what percentage result in a recommendation for guardianship proceedings? He went very still. I said, and are you aware that this conversation has been recorded under Vermont's single-party consent statute since I walked through your door? The color changed in his face, not dramatically. A subtle withdrawal, the face pulling slightly inward the way it does when someone understands for the first time that the room they thought they were in is a different room. I stood up. I said, I spent 32 years as a federal judge. I know what you are doing, and I know exactly what it constitutes under Vermont law. I am giving you the professional courtesy of this warning before the next part begins. I walked out. I nodded to Walt in the waiting room and said, let's go home. He drove the return route with both hands on the wheel and said very little. Halfway to Montpelier, he asked how the appointment had gone. I said about as I had expected. We drove the rest of the way in silence. Not a comfortable silence, not an uncomfortable one. The particular silence of 2 people who are both aware that something has shifted and neither of whom is ready to say what it is. The house was lit from inside when we arrived. Dana met us at the door. She looked at Walt's face first for the result, which told me everything about who had designed this and who had been executing it. She recalibrated in 2 seconds, turning to me with a solicitous expression and asking how I was feeling. I said I was tired, that I was going to make tea and sit in my chair. She offered to make the tea. I let her. I needed her in the kitchen. I went to my armchair and opened my book. From the kitchen, I heard her voice, low and taut. What happened? What did he say? Did he get what he needed? Walt's voice. I don't know. He went in alone. He didn't say much on the way back. Her voice, lower. I'm calling him right now. I turned a page. She came out 15 minutes later with the tea and set it on the side table with a smile and sat on the couch and picked up her phone with the practiced casualness of someone who had just made a call they would prefer I not know about. I drank the tea and did not indicate that I noticed anything. At 7:45 that evening, Detective Okafor knocked on my front door. He came with 2 other officers and a colleague from the Financial Crimes Unit who had a warrant. Walt opened the door because he was closest to it. He looked at the badge and then at the warrant and stood in the doorway with an expression I recognized from 30 32 years of sentencing hearings. The expression of someone for whom the abstract has just become specific and inescapable, and who is processing in real time what that means. Dana appeared in the hallway behind him. She looked at the officers, and then she looked past them, and her eyes found me in my armchair. I held her gaze and did not look away. I stayed in my chair while Detective Okafor explained the warrants and what would happen next. I watched my son's face during this. I will not pretend I was not looking for something there. Some residue of the person who used to fall asleep in the back seat of the car on long drives, who called me from his first week of college just to hear a familiar voice, who once told me, without apparent self-consciousness at the age of 9, that I was his best friend in the world. I looked for that person in the face of the man standing in my doorway while a detective read from a warrant document, and I found fragments, pieces, not a whole. He looked at me once, directly. I did not look away from that either. Dana was taken to the station for questioning. Walt was asked to come voluntarily, and he agreed. The physician had already been contacted by the state medical board on Raymond's initiative by the time the officers left my house. The house went quiet. I sat for a very long time in the chair. The kitchen light was still on, a glass in the sink, the ordinary evidence of an evening that had gone in the direction it had to go. I picked up my phone and called Patricia Aldridge. She did not answer. I left a message telling her I was ready to move forward with the estate and that I had some specific ideas about what I wanted to do. The scholarship, the lake property, the portfolio under careful, vetted management. I told her I wanted to handle it the way Margaret had asked me to. I have thought in the months since about Dana's voice on the porch that November evening. He doesn't have to be actually showing it. He just has to be documented as showing it. I have thought about the casualness of that, the pragmatism of it, the way a person arrives at that sentence and says it out loud in a house where someone else has lived for 21 years and means every piece of furniture and every worn floorboard and every morning of ordinary life that a person gets only once and treats it as a logistical problem to be solved. I have thought about what that says about how she saw me, not as a person with a history and a sister and a rocking chair I had been meaning to finish for 2 years, as an obstacle with a balance sheet attached. Walt received a suspended sentence and 3 years of probation based on his partial cooperation and his attorney's argument, which was not entirely inaccurate, that he had been a secondary actor in a scheme designed by someone else. Dana received 18 months. The physician surrendered his license before the board hearing concluded and pleaded no contest to charges that would follow him the rest of his career. I did not go to the sentencing hearings. Walt has called twice since. I listened to both messages twice and sat with the phone afterward without knowing quite what I was waiting for. The second message was longer. He did not explain or make excuses, which I had expected him to do, and he did not. He talked mostly about the summer we built the stone wall along the back property line when he was 16. 2 weeks of weekends, the two of us, sourcing flat stones from the back field and laying them without mortar in the old New England way, and Walt asking me every 20 minutes whether it looked straight. He said he did not know why he was thinking about that particular summer. I knew why. The wall is still there. It will outlast both of us if it is tended. The rocking chair is finished. I gave it 2 coats of oil against the winter and set it on the porch where I can see it from the driveway when I come home. Pine weathers silver if you leave it without a finish, which I had not known before I built it, and the oil preserves that silver color rather than fighting it. It looks a little like driftwood. It looks like something that has been outside long enough to have earned its place there. I sat in it last week in the early evening, in the cold, and thought about 32 years of decisions I had made from behind a bench, and about Margaret typing 11 lines on her will, and about the particular weight of a victory that has already cost something irreplaceable by the time you arrive at the winning. I sat there and let both things be true at the same time. The law had worked exactly as it was designed to work, and I had lost something I was not going to get back. Both of those things were true and would remain true. And sitting in the silver chair in the Vermont winter, I let them be exactly that. 2 true things, existing together without resolution. I will call Walt, not yet, but I will.